Yo, welcome back for another episode of Into the Flu. Today's going to be another deck tech for you. This is going to be a Snape deck that I built a while ago. I haven't really played it much, but it's kind of a unique deck, so I figured it would be cool to just kind of go over. So for those that don't know, Professor Snape's ability is, once per game, you may shuffle up to 7 non-healing cards from your discard pile into your deck, which is always good. Having something, a card like Professor Snape or Madame Pomfrey, just being able to kind of shuffle in some of those cards is always a good thing for ensuring that you've got a hefty deck still. So Professor Snape also provides 1 potion power. So what this means is if I wanted to play a potion card or a card that requires potion lessons, Professor Snape provides that lesson power. But it's not like if they say discard a lesson, you can't discard Snape. It just provides the power of the lesson. But what that means is, for this particular deck, it's actually a tri-color deck. So I've got Care Magical Creature cards, Charms cards, and Potion cards. And in these 2 decks, I have 10 Care Magical Creature lessons and 10 Charms lessons, but I don't have any additional lessons for potions because, again, Snape provides that for me. So this is 20 lessons here total, and I'll set those off to the side, and now we're going to dig into what the cards are. So I'm going to go through all of the cards and then kind of talk about some of the mechanics and the actual gameplay itself. So we've got Swelling Solution, which costs 7 of that potion. So for those of you that are kind of new to the game, so what this means is if I had 6 lessons, a combination of Charms and Care Magical Creatures, Snape provides this 7th lesson power. Because 1 of them is the potions, then that means I can play it. So if I only had 7 charms in play, I wouldn't be able to play any of my Care Magical Creatures because I would only have this 1 potion power lesson and charms lesson. So I need to be able to have at least 1 lesson that's of the same color. So just for those who might be looking into these videos and kind of stumbling upon this, you might not know. All right, so we've got Swelling Solution, which is a spell. Do 8 damage to your opponent. He or she can prevent this by choosing 3 cards in his or her hand and discarding them. So we've got 3 of those. We've got Snuffling Potion, 4 of those, which says next turn, whenever your opponent draws a card, he or she discards it instead of putting it into his or her hand. 2 Potions Project. Your opponent takes damage until he or she discards a total of 2 cards from his or her lesson. I love Potions Project. So, essentially if somebody is wherever in the game, the beginning of the game, the end of the game, whatever. But if you notice that they're kind of stacking up lessons, they might not have those 2 other lessons in their deck. So they're essentially just taking a bunch of damage that equate to spells or adventures or, whatever. But once they reach that 2 lesson mark, then they're able to stop taking the damage. But having a couple of those in your deck is always fun. And then I have Bundamum Ooze, which is a spell. Your opponent chooses 1 of his or her creatures or items in play and discards it. Then he or she takes damage equal to the printed power cost, which is always fun. So, gotta love those. So now we're going to go into our creature cards or Care Magical Creature cards. I've got a Garden Gnome. At the end of each of your opponent's turn, if there are any cards in his or her hand, he or she chooses 1 of them and discards it. So you can kind of see the theme here where I'm trying to get rid of cards of the opponent, right? Garden Gnome is really annoying because what starts to happen is there's this sort of psychology that takes place, at least for me, when someone pulls Garden Gnome. I'm like, well, I don't want to draw any more cards because I'm just going to have to get rid of them anyway. So then the hand itself that I have starts to slim down. So it's really kind of interesting, but Garden Gnome can be very annoying, and there's 4 of those in there in the deck. And then we've got 4 Black Bat, which are really good. I really like Black Bat. The second that you put it into play, it does 2 damage automatically, and then each turn it does 2 damage as well. So it's always nice to just kind of stack up. So in addition to the damage that you're doing with your Black Bat consistently, and these spells like Swelling Solution or even Potions Project, you're able to do the damage and then also have the Garden Gnome take from the hand. So you're kind of taking from both, which is nice. All right, so then we've got Alohomora. Search your deck. You may take a location or adventure card from your deck, show it to your opponent, and put it into your hand, then shuffle. So we've got 2 of those. We've got 3 Backfire here. Do 5 damage to your opponent. Just kind of straightforward, doing some damage, making sure that you're kind of racking those up. Purple Firecrackers is another spell we've got. Your opponent chooses 3 cards in his or her hand and discards them. If he or she has fewer than 3 cards in his or her hand, then they discard all of them. So we've got 2 of those. Now we've got 4 Ransacked. Your opponent chooses 2 cards in his or her hand and discards them. 1 if he or she only has 1. And then we've got the Burrow. So some of you who might know what this deck is, then it might kind of be familiar to you now. So before each player's turn, if that player has fewer than 4 cards in his or her hand, that player draws cards until he or she has 4. Okay, and then last but not least, we've got some good adventures. As I've mentioned before, I really like having adventures, so that's always fun. All right, so we've got 3 Candy Cart. Play this card only if you have at least 3 lessons in play. The effect is before each of your opponent's turns, he or she draws 3 cards and then chooses 3 cards in his or her hand and discards them. To solve it, your opponent takes 10 damage. And then the reward is your opponent may draw a card. So just kind of it's super annoying card. And, at the end, they usually are going to take the 10 damage because you're going to eventually get rid of so many cards by doing this that you might as well just take the damage. All right, next we've got 2 Through the Flue. Before each of your opponent's turns, he or she draws 3 cards and then chooses 3 in hand and discards them. So very the same essentially as Candy Card. The difference is to solve it, your opponent chooses 1 of his or her locations in play or 4 of his or her lessons in play and discards them. So equally crappy. And then the reward is that I would take 3 damage. Got 2 of those. And then now we've got 2 Escaping the Dursley. The effect is your opponent can't use actions to play any cards except lesson cards, so very similar to Caught by Snape. And then to solve, your opponent discards his or her hand, which sucks, but again, kind of in the theme of trying to get rid of your opponent's hand. And then the reward is your opponent searches his or her deck for any card, puts it into their hand, and then shuffles the deck. So we're going to look at 2 cards that are in this deck, specifically the Burrow and Snuffling Potion. So Snuffling Potion says, next turn, whenever your opponent draws a card, he or she discards it instead of putting it into his or her hand. The Burrow says, before each player's turn, if that player has fewer than 4 cards in his or her hand, that player draws cards until he or she has 4. So there was talk of this deck, and I forget who it was. It's been kind of a while now, so I apologize. But if you're watching this and you can post, they mentioned this combination here, which is kind of like a deadly sort of combination. So if you manage to be able to get rid of your opponent's hand, or at least get fewer than 4 cards in their hand by way of combination of any of these things, the gnome, having them get rid of their hand, get rid of 1 card, Escaping the Dursleys, which has you get rid of their hand in order to solve the adventure, and just always continuing to do damage, etc. And then if you have the Burrow in play and they have like a pretty slim hand or none at all, then again, before each player's turn, if that player has fewer than 4 cards in his or her hand, that player draws until he or she has 4. But then if you were to play the Snuffling Potion spell, then whenever they draw a card, they discard it instead. So now they end up in this loop where the Burrow says, because you have, let's say, 2 cards in your hand, you have to draw until you have 4. But because I played Snuffling Potion, you're going to continue discarding those next two, but you're still only going to have two in your hand. So you're going to continue discarding it until you essentially run out of your deck, because you're now stuck in this loop between what the burrow is asking you to do and what the spell is making you do. So next turn, whenever your opponent draws a card, he or she discards it instead of putting it into his or her hand. So again, with the burrow in play and with Snuffling Potion, you've got a really funny kind of way that your opponent is just going to drain their deck until they're dead. If that doesn't work though, which I've played this deck and this combination just for some reason didn't come up, or, you know, whatever it was, they discard the burrow, or I didn't draw the card right, whatever the case may be. You have kind of enough damage anyway to slim down your opponent's deck to a point where they're unable to really hold anything significant in their hand. And then, you know, you get some damage here and there, and then next thing you know, it's over for them. So it's a pretty good deck. I do enjoy it. Anytime I have Black Bat that kind of does that damage, or, you know, even escaping the Dursleys, it sort of helps me with locking them down, and then their only ability is to get rid of their hand. You know, that's always nice too. So another pretty fun deck. I hope you enjoyed. If you have any questions or comments, I know that this kind of combination was a little bit popular, like, you know, a couple of years ago. So if anybody has any comments on how they used to play it, or if they've played it, then, you know, please, as always, share. And I'll continue to bring out some of these deck techs for you. And as always, have fun, be safe, and we'll see you next time.